You know, some memories just hit you out of nowhere. One minute you're strolling down a familiar street, your mind on autopilot, and then, bam, something, or rather someone, jolts you back to another life. That's exactly what happened to me that day. One of those chilly, overcast afternoons when everything feels like it's stuck in a perpetual gray haze. It was one of those dreary November days when the air felt sharp and unwelcoming, even in the city. I was rushing through the usual afternoon crowd, my mind already on the art gallery I was headed to. I'd been invited by a collector, a big deal in the art world, and for someone like me, whose life revolves around connections, image, and charm, this was an opportunity. One I couldn't miss. I barely noticed the figure slumped on the bench just outside the gallery. He was huddled in a threadbare coat, the collar pulled up against the wind. People flowed past him like he wasn't there. And honestly, I might have done the same, except he looked up. And our eyes met. "Olivia?" he asked, his voice a rasp, rough and unfamiliar. My heart skipped a beat. I could barely believe it. "Leo?" I whispered back, almost afraid I'd conjured him out of some misplaced nostalgia. But it was him, Leo Carter, the same Leo who'd been my whole world once, back in college, the man who'd written songs for me on his guitar, who'd dreamed of starting a nonprofit, who'd made me feel, well, like I was the only person in the room. And now, here he was, with dark circles under his eyes, his face gaunt, a stranger who looked like he'd survived a storm or two. We stood there, staring at each other for what felt like forever. "It's been a long time," he murmured, looking away. There was a flicker of shame in his eyes, as if he was apologizing for being there, in that state, for me to see. "Yes, it has," I replied, my voice barely audible over the city sounds around us. A bus rumbled by. People's voices floated past, but all I could focus on was Leo. This ghost from my past who had somehow found his way back to me. For a moment, I wanted to turn away, to walk into the gallery and pretend I hadn't seen him. But something stopped me. Maybe it was curiosity or guilt or something deeper, something that reminded me of the person I used to be. What happened, Leo?" I asked, my voice soft, tentative. I didn't want to pry, but I couldn't keep the question from slipping out. He shrugged, a bitter smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Life happened, I guess. A series of wrong turns, bad luck, you know the story. I wanted to say I did, but the truth was, I didn't. My life had been anything but a series of wrong turns. I'd made calculated decisions, moved up the social and career ladder with precision, always knowing where I was headed. And Leo, he'd been part of that past I'd left behind, a part I'd tried to forget. But now, seeing him like this, couldn't help but feel a pang of something, regret maybe, or guilt. I'd always wondered, in those quiet moments late at night, what might have been. And now, here he was, looking at me with a mix of surprise and sadness. Before I could say more, someone called my name. I turned to see Jacob, my boyfriend, standing by the gallery entrance, his arms crossed, an unreadable expression on his face. He was dressed impeccably, as always, his posture straight and confident. He looked from me to Leo, a frown tugging at his lips.
"Olivia," he called, his voice sharp. "Are you coming?" I felt a surge of embarrassment, my cheeks flushing as I glanced back at Leo. I could see the hurt in his eyes, the way he was trying to shrink into himself, as if he wanted to disappear. "I'll be right there," I replied, forcing a smile. But the smile felt hollow, fake. I turned back to Leo, my voice soft. It was good to see you, Leo." He nodded, his gaze dropping to the ground. "Yeah. You too." I wanted to say something more, to offer him help, maybe even ask him for a coffee. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I walked away, leaving him on that bench, his figure fading into the background as I stepped into the warm, polished world of the gallery. But even as I looked at the paintings, nodded politely at the other guests, and tried to focus on the art around me, I couldn't shake the image of Leo's face, the haunted look in his eyes. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a nagging sense of doubt. A feeling that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the person I thought I was. Scene 2: The gallery and Jacob's reaction. Jacob was quiet for most of the evening, but I could feel the tension simmering beneath his calm exterior. He kept glancing at me, his mouth pressed into a thin line, his eyes hard and calculating. It wasn't until we were leaving the gallery that he finally spoke. "Who was that?" he asked, his tone clipped, barely hiding the annoyance. I hesitated, feeling a wave of defensiveness rise up within me. An old friend, I replied, keeping my voice steady. We went to college together. Jacob snorted, his expression one of disbelief. Friend? He didn't look like much of a friend to me. More like a charity case. I felt my jaw tighten, a surge of anger bubbling up inside me. He's had a rough time, Jacob. Not everyone has the same advantages. He raised an eyebrow, his gaze cold and unyielding. Advantages? Olivia, you don't even know this man anymore. He's a stranger. For all you know, he could be dangerous. Or worse, he could be using you. The words stung, sharp and cruel. I wanted to defend Leo, to tell Jacob he was wrong. But a small voice in the back of my mind whispered doubt. Jacob had a way of making me question things, a way of twisting my thoughts until I wasn't sure what I believed anymore. Maybe you're right, I murmured, though the words tasted bitter on my tongue. But I can't just ignore him, Jacob. I can't pretend he doesn't exist. Jacob sighed, shaking his head. Just be careful, Olivia. People don't end up like that for no reason. They make choices, and those choices have consequences. He didn't say anything more, but his words lingered, casting a shadow over the memory of Leo's face, his hollow eyes and broken smile. And as we drove home in silence, I couldn't help but wonder, was Jacob right? Had Leo brought this on himself? Or was there something more, something I didn't understand? Scene 3, offering Leo a job. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about Leo. His face haunted me, the way he'd looked at me with a mixture of hope and shame. I felt an ache in my chest, a strange sense of responsibility that I couldn't shake. So, against my better judgment, and against Jacob's warnings, I found myself back on that street corner, searching for him. The bench was empty, the streets bustling with the usual crowd of office workers and tourists. For a moment, I thought he was gone, lost to the city once more. But then I spotted him, sitting on a low wall by the park, his hands tucked into his coat, his head bowed. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and walked over. Leo? I called softly, my voice barely carrying over the hum of traffic. He looked up, surprise flickering in his eyes. Olivia? I managed a small smile, feeling a wave of relief wash over me. Hey. I was hoping to see you again. He shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as if afraid someone might see him. Why? He asked, his tone wary, guarded. I took a deep breath, the words spilling out before I could stop myself. I was thinking, maybe I could help you. With a job. Just something to get you back on your feet. He stared at me, his expression a mix of disbelief and something else, something like hope. But he shook his head, his gaze dropping to the ground. I don't know, Olivia. I don't want your pity. It's not pity, I insisted, my voice firm. I know what you're capable of, Leo. I remember who you were. He looked up, meeting my gaze, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of the man I'd once known, the man I'd loved. Are you sure? He whispered, his voice barely audible. Yes, I replied, reaching out to touch his hand. Let me help you, Leo. Please. And as he nodded, a tentative smile breaking across his face, I felt a spark of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope, maybe. Or a second chance. Scene 4, workplace dynamics and Jacob's growing hostility. When Leo arrived at the office for his first day, I was filled with equal parts excitement and anxiety. I'd arranged for a modest position, an assistant role that would give him a start without overwhelming him. I'd also coached him briefly on office etiquette and the general structure of the work. But as he walked in, dressed in the simple, clean clothes I'd bought for him, his eyes were cast down, his shoulders slightly hunched, as though he was trying to make himself as small and invisible as possible. From my office, I watched the subtle reactions of the employees as he entered. A few exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of curiosity and judgment. Others whispered behind cupped hands. Most kept their distance, offering polite, distant smiles before resuming their work. There were only a few who greeted him warmly, offering to show him around and help him settle in. Leo had been through so much, I could see the unease in his every movement. He'd confided to me about how difficult it was to accept help after all he'd endured. His pride had taken a hit when he'd lost everything, and accepting a job from me, someone he once loved, was its own type of vulnerability. He caught my eye from across the office and offered a tentative wave, his face brightening slightly. I waved back, feeling a rush of encouragement. But just as I was about to walk over and check on him, Jacob intercepted me, his expression hard and unyielding. "Really, Olivia," he said, his voice low but laced with disapproval. "You're actually going through with this?" "Yes, Jacob," I replied, forcing myself to stay calm. "I trust him, and I think he deserves a chance. We all have setbacks. Not everyone's life goes exactly to plan." Jacob shook his head, his jaw clenched. "I just don't get it. Why are you doing this? It's one thing to reconnect with an old friend, but to bring him into the company, into our lives." He looked past me, his gaze narrowing as he watched Leo struggle to fit into the office dynamic. "Jacob," I said, meeting his gaze steadily, "I believe people deserve second chances. This is important to me. Can't you just support me on this?" He scoffed, crossing his arms. "Support you? I'm just being realistic. People don't end up homeless for no reason, Olivia. And you're so quick to just hand him an opportunity on a silver platter." I could feel anger rising in me, a mixture of defensiveness and disappointment. "This isn't a silver platter situation, Jacob. He's starting at the bottom, just like anyone else would. And he's worked hard all his life until life got hard for him. Have you never needed help before?" Jacob's eyes narrowed, his voice sharp. "Not the way he has, no. I'm just saying, don't expect me to pick up the pieces when this goes sideways." I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, that Leo was nothing like he assumed. But I knew Jacob wouldn't hear it, not right now. His mind was made up, and his cold gaze on Leo only intensified as he left my office. That was when I started to feel the real weight of the situation. Jacob didn't trust Leo. He didn't even trust me to make this decision. And that tension, I feared, would only grow. Scene 5. Olivia and Leo bond over memories. A few days later, I invited Leo to lunch, partly because I wanted to escape the office tension, but also because I missed the ease we'd once shared. The cafe was quiet, filled with the gentle hum of conversation and the smell of fresh coffee and baked goods. We took a seat by the window, and for a moment, I felt like we were back in college, two people with dreams too big for the world. "Do you remember that time we drove to the beach at midnight?" I asked, a smile tugging at the corners of my lips. Leo chuckled softly, his eyes lighting up with the memory. "I remember you almost convinced me to quit everything and just live by the ocean." His gaze turned wistful, distant. "Those were good days. Simple. We didn't care about careers or money, just each other." I nodded, feeling a pang of regret. "Yeah, and then life happened." Leo sighed, looking down at his coffee. "Life has a way of doing that, doesn't it?" He took a deep breath, his fingers tracing the edge of his cup. "After college, I thought I had it all figured out. A steady job, plans to travel, maybe even start my nonprofit. But things got tough. Layoffs, debts, then my mom got sick, and I had to take care of her. One thing after another, and suddenly, I was here." He spoke softly, his voice tinged with shame, but there was a resilience in his eyes, a quiet strength that had survived despite everything. And as I listened, I felt a mix of admiration and sadness. Leo had faced battles I could hardly imagine, and yet, he was still standing. "Leo, I'm sorry," I whispered, reaching out to touch his hand. I wish. I wish I could have been there for you. He looked up, his expression softening. You don't have to apologize, Olivia. I'm grateful for you now. I don't know what I would have done without this opportunity. But it's hard sometimes to feel like I deserve it. You do deserve it, I said firmly. I believe in you, Leo. And I'll stand by that. In that moment, I saw a glimmer of the man he'd been, the kind, hopeful dreamer who'd once held my heart. And as we sat there, talking about the past, sharing stories and memories, I felt something rekindle between us, a quiet, unspoken bond that was more than just friendship. It was trust. A reminder that even though we'd both changed, we still understood each other in a way no one else did. Scene 6: Jacob accuses Leo. The tension finally came to a head a week later. I was in my office, sorting through paperwork, when I heard raised voices outside. I looked up to see Jacob storming in, his face flushed with anger, his eyes blazing. He stole from me, Jacob spat, holding up his wallet, empty and worn. I knew it. I knew he was up to no good. I felt my stomach drop, a surge of panic rising within me. Jacob, what are you talking about? He threw the wallet onto my desk, his voice sharp and accusatory. I had cash in here, Olivia. Over $100. And now it's gone. Don't you see? He's using you. He's playing you. I took a deep breath, fighting to stay calm. Are you sure? Maybe you just misplaced it. Let's not jump to conclusions. Misplaced it? Jacob sneered, his tone dripping with contempt. Are you kidding me? I knew this would happen. You let a stranger, a homeless man, no less, into our lives, into the company, and now he's taking advantage of it. I could feel the eyes of our coworkers on us, their whispers and glances creating a cloud of doubt around me. I wanted to believe Leo, to trust him, but Jacob's accusations were hitting a nerve. What if he was right? What if Leo had let me down? But deep down, I couldn't bring myself to believe it. Not after everything Leo had shared, the honesty in his eyes, the vulnerability he'd shown. I looked at Jacob, my voice trembling but resolute. I'm not going to condemn him without proof, Jacob. I believe in second chances. And I believe in him. Jacob scoffed, shaking his head. Then you're a fool, Olivia. A naive, sentimental fool. He stormed out, leaving me standing there, torn between loyalty and doubt, the weight of my decision pressing down on me. I felt the eyes of my colleagues on me, the judgment in their gazes. But I wouldn't turn my back on Leo. Not until I had the truth. Scene 7: The truth unfolds. Later that day, I sat alone in my office, replaying Jacob's accusations in my mind. It gnawed at me, the uncertainty, the gnawing doubt. And so, reluctantly, I decided to dig a little deeper. I pulled up the security footage from that day, watching as Leo went about his tasks, his every movement careful, precise. But as I reviewed the footage, something caught my eye. It wasn't Leo, it was Jacob. In the footage, I saw him slip something into his pocket, a wad of cash. My heart pounded, realization dawning on me. Jacob had staged the whole thing. He'd set Leo up, trying to sabotage him, to drive him out. I felt a mix of anger and relief, a surge of fury that Jacob had gone to such lengths to manipulate me, to control the narrative. But as the truth sank in, I also felt a profound sense of guilt. I'd doubted Leo, even if only for a moment. And that doubt had nearly cost him everything. The next day, I confronted Jacob, my voice steady but filled with anger. I saw the footage, Jacob. I know what you did. He tried to deny it, his voice smooth and manipulative, but I held my ground, refusing to let him twist the truth any longer. And in that moment, I saw him for who he truly was, a man driven by jealousy, insecurity, and fear. A man who would stop at nothing to control me. As he left, defeated and humiliated, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. But the damage had been done. And now, I had to make things right with Leo. Scene 8: Redemption and Reconnection. That evening, I found Leo in the park, sitting on the same bench where we'd met. His face was drawn, tired, but he looked up as I approached, a faint spark of hope in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Leo," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "I should have trusted you. I should have known." He looked at me, his gaze softening. "It's okay, Olivia. I don't blame you. It's hard to change people's minds about me." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything unsaid lingering between us. And then, slowly, he reached out, his hand warm and solid in mine. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft. "For believing in me. For giving me a chance." I smiled, a tear slipping down my cheek. "You've more than earned it, Leo." And as we sat there, side by side, I felt a quiet sense of peace settle over me. A reminder that sometimes, the people we least expect end up being the ones who change us the most. Scene 9: A New Chapter. Several months passed, and with each day, I watched Leo grow into his new role with confidence and resilience. He was no longer the man who'd slumped on that cold city bench, eyes filled with shame. He'd become a trusted member of the team, diligent and dependable. His work ethic and natural empathy quickly won over even the skeptics in the office, and soon, people were coming to him for advice, seeking his opinion on projects, treating him with the respect he deserved. One afternoon, as I watched him interact with colleagues from across the office, I felt a surge of pride, and something else, something more personal. Leo had reminded me of the importance of compassion, of seeing beyond a person's circumstances to understand their journey. And he'd taught me a lot about myself, too, about the person I wanted to be. As for me, my life had changed, too. The experience with Leo had made me look at my world differently, had made me question the things I'd once taken for granted. I found myself drawn to causes and people I'd once ignored, spending time at shelters, volunteering with organizations that helped people get back on their feet. I wanted to give back, to make a difference in a way that went beyond my career and social status. Jacob, of course, was long gone. He'd left the company, severing our relationship with the same cold calculation that had always defined him. But in the end, I was grateful. He'd shown me who he truly was, and in doing so, he'd freed me from a life I'd never truly wanted. Scene 10: Final Reflection. One evening, after everyone else had gone home, Leo knocked on my office door. He'd just been promoted to a managerial position, and he looked proud, but also nervous, as though he wasn't quite sure if he deserved it. "Got a minute?" he asked, his voice soft. "Of course," I replied, smiling, gesturing for him to come in. He took a seat across from me, fidgeting with the edge of his jacket. "I just wanted to thank you," he said finally, his eyes meeting mine with a sincerity that took my breath away. "I don't know where I'd be if you hadn't come up to me that day. I might not even be here. You saved me, Olivia." I shook my head, feeling a lump in my throat. "Leo, I didn't save you. I just gave you a chance. You did the rest yourself. You have so much strength, more than I ever realized." We sat in silence for a moment, a shared understanding passing between us. This journey, the trials and challenges, had brought us closer in ways I hadn't anticipated. But it wasn't the same love we'd once shared, it was something deeper, more enduring. It was a bond born of struggle, resilience, and respect. Finally, Leo spoke, his voice soft. "I've been thinking, maybe it's time for me to give back, too. To help others like you helped me. I've been talking to a few people about starting a mentorship program, helping people who've been through tough times get back on their feet." I felt a smile spread across my face, pride swelling in my chest. "That sounds incredible, Leo. I think you'd be perfect for it." He grinned, a genuine, open smile that erased the shadows from his eyes. "Thank you, Olivia. For everything." As he left, I sat alone in my office, gazing out the window at the city lights below. I thought about that first encounter with Leo, how different he'd looked, how lost he'd seemed. And now, here we were, both of us changed, both of us stronger, both of us finally at peace with the paths our lives had taken. Epilogue, full circle. Months later, I stood in a room full of people, watching Leo address a group of new recruits in his mentorship program. He spoke with confidence, his words carrying the weight of experience, his voice filled with hope. He talked about his journey, the struggles he'd faced, and the people who'd believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. And as I listened, I realized how much he'd grown, how far he'd come. In that moment, I felt a quiet sense of closure. This wasn't just Leo's story or my story, it was our story, a story about redemption, compassion, and the power of second chances. And I knew, as I watched him speak, that we'd both found something far more valuable than we'd ever expected. As the event wound down, Leo walked over to me, a smile on his face. "So, what's next for you?" I laughed, feeling a lightness in my heart that I hadn't felt in years. "I don't know, Leo. But whatever it is, I'll make sure it's meaningful." He nodded, his eyes bright. "I'm glad to hear it. You deserve it, Olivia." And as we stood there, two people who had found each other again after so many years, I felt a quiet sense of peace settle over me. Life had taken us on separate paths, but somehow, we'd ended up exactly where we were meant to be. The end.